Hi everyone, we have a lot of information to get through today, so we're gonna kick off now, and then we're recording this session, so we're gonna send it around afterwards. Thank you for your time today. My name is Yodit. This is a really important session that we're doing. A lot of research has been coming out regarding the links between the indoor environment factors and variables and COVID. And what we try to do is really summarize a lot of the peer-reviewed and non-peer-reviewed session research that's been going on over the last few months and present it in a way that makes sense for the office environment. As I mentioned before, this session is recorded. We'll circulate the slides, the video after this. There is a chat function that the team will be looking at. So if you've got questions, please drop them in. During your sign up as well, we've asked for your specific questions, so we're going to try to cover that as much as possible. Air quality and what is coming out, air quality and variables are extremely important in terms of safety, and monitoring it and really understanding the benchmarks that you should be following is quite critical. And we're trying to keep this dialogue going. A lot of the research is going to be evolving, but we're going to link to at least the most important benchmark research that you need to be aware of with the follow-up as well. Today I am joined by Bruno, who's the co-founder of South Coast Science. I've known Bruno for a long time. They focused on two things that are very, very interesting to me. Open infrastructure for air quality monitoring. They are experts in indoor monitoring and outdoor monitoring. They've partnered with AlphaSense, who I believe are Europe's leading largest air quality manufacturers.
Sensor manufacturers.
Oh, sorry, sensor manufacturers. And you focused on quality and open infrastructure, which I think is quite critical. And there's a lot of myths surrounding this environment. So I'm really interested in learning more from you, Bruno.
Working for the last 7 years in the process of delivering quality data from known as small sensors. In other words, sensors that allow you to build a device that could be the size of a shoebox or perhaps ultimately the size of a packet of playing cards, as opposed to reference equipment that scientists have been used to using and cost tens of thousands of pounds and take up a lot of space. You know, what we're trying to do is disruptive, and it opens up new places where you can measure air quality to a standard of accuracy that's comparable to the reference equipment. It's been a long process to get there.
And one of the things we'll go into quite deeply is the trust in the data, right? Like you can do all sorts of fancy data analysis. If you can't trust the accuracy of the data, it's going to be all efforts are useless. So just to be clear, and this is to set the scene, like there is no technology to monitor airborne concentrations of COVID-19. What we now know, what the consensus is really kind of coming around, is that we can monitor the parameters that influence the likelihood of infection or the safety of the indoor environment. The main parameters that the research is showing are significantly important is temperature, humidity, particulate, occupant density, which is basically the number of people in that environment. And so we're going to explore this, and we're going to try to kind of break down on how these things influence the indoor environment. Just to outline, what we're really talking about is controlling the likelihood of infection. And what safety means is reducing the likelihood of infection within an environment. There's three things that have been shown to have a significant influence on the safety of the environment from a COVID perspective. The first one is points that make the virus strong, or the survivability of the virus. And this is around temperature and relative humidity. So when temperature is low, when relative humidity is also low, this enables the virus to be stronger. That's kind of the simplest terms I can think of to describe it. So when temperature is cold and relative humidity is fairly 30 and so marked, it makes the virus kind of stronger and transmits easier. So if you think of refrigeration-like environments, especially when you see all the news headlines where there's high amounts of infection in things like meat packing plants, you can think about what kind of environment these people are working in. They're working in very cold environments, very dry air environments, and so forth. So keep in mind that the benchmarks that we're seeing through the research is relative humidity, keeping it between 40 and 60%, temperature, keeping it not too cold, so about 21 degrees or higher. The second cornerstone to keep an eye on is immune system of the person that is the user of the space. And again, we're seeing and research come out around the effect of relative humidity to temperature and also affect people's immune systems. Third, I suppose, cornerstone or measure that you need to think about is around exposure. So we're talking about exposure in terms of viral load, like how much of the virus is in circulation. That is affected by obviously the number of people in a space, so occupancy, and also the ventilation, right? Like how much fresh air is in that space, how much kind of air circulation is there. And really, like, I suppose the proxy for the freshness of the air in a space is CO2.
I think that's such an important point. We've always understood that CO2 levels in internal air are really important to the good functioning of human beings and other animals. Clearly, if CO2 is not in moderate quantities toxic, but you will become less effective, think less clearly in high CO2 levels. But now it's taken on a completely new meaning, because let's say we have a certain number of infected people in an internal space, there will be some level of COVID present in the air. That density of COVID is determined by the number of people divided by the airflow. So as CO2 represents people breathing out, the necessity to move air, the amount of air you need to move, can be seen by that CO2 level.
And we've seen this from experience, right? Pre-COVID, let's say a base level for that particular office, which could vary between kind of 300 and 400 as a starting point at, let's say, 8 a.m. in the morning. And as people come in, you see it eventually rising as the buildup concentrates, especially if it's poorly ventilated. You see kind of CO2 spiking over the day and then going back down again as people leave. So we've seen this kind of correlation of CO2 and occupancy often. Now it's becoming critical because it is indicating, like you said, not enough fresh air is in there. So we're kind of the guidance that we're seeing is keeping CO2 between 500 and 600 parts per million in terms of a measure. And then we'll go into this much more. But I just wanted to set the scene. This is what we're looking at in terms of safety. These three measures are important. Keep them in mind. We'll keep coming back to them over and over again. But from your side, Bruno, we've heard this argument that, kind of we've been measuring air quality using diffusion tubes and so forth historically. Like, why sensors? Why does it matter now? Can you go into it a little bit?
People have traditionally used diffusion tubes. They're the equivalent of a film camera. You expose the tube and you send it off to the lab to be processed and you get back the result. They're very accurate and they're very cheap. Problem is that they answer the wrong question. If you are managing a building, what you want to know is what is the exposure of the occupants. Those occupants may be there only from 8 a.m. till 6 p.m. That might be the most polluted time of the day in that part of the city. So we need to know what is the exposure of the inhabitants, the occupants of the building, rather than what is the 24-hour exposure of the building itself. And the answer will be quite different. And it's a challenge in the kind of industry I work with, primarily been looking at pollution levels outdoors, across the world, from Fairbanks, Alaska to Addis Ababa to south of Chile. But this was all outdoor work. But how a building translates that for the occupants is the place where we're all trying to look now. This is a profound correlation that's been tested in several places around the world. It was a big issue, for example, in northern Italy, where spikes were correlated very, very well with PM levels, which vary from town and city across Italy. And this figure of 1 microgram is really important to the instrument makers, to the device makers, because to distinguish 1 microgram per cubic meter is quite challenging. And yet we see 1 microgram in what I think was a really solid study having a big effect on COVID death rate. In other words, we're not sure whether PM 2.5 is an enabler for the movement of COVID viruses, or that's almost a separate subject. The issue here is that exposure to PM 2.5 compromises your immune system, and it means if you do get infected, you're more likely to be in trouble.
And we talk about particulates as 2.5, 10, and so forth. Like, can you give a bit of a context for those that aren't necessarily aware what this means? What is the difference? What do these numbers signify?
It's taken time to differentiate these things in terms of medical studies. It's quite hard to study the long-term impact of an environmental factor. Broadly speaking, PM10 PM10 and PM2.5 are the two sizes of particles. So there's quite a spectrum of size, and we arbitrarily divide it up into PM1, PM2.5, and PM10. PM10 is, in most of the world, in most cities, is soot, it's carbon, and it's the stuff that makes the snot in your nose go black when you travel on the underground. It's actually not too harmful, it seems, because your body has defenses against these very big particles. 2.5, it seems like your body can't reject 2.5 particulates as well, and this seems to cause a long-term damage to the lungs. Just to have the instrumentation to get reliable PM1 figures has been challenging. We're doing it now, so in future there will be medical results on that, but we need to go on measuring PM1s for quite some time.
In an indoor environment, are you seeing PM 2.5 coming into an indoor environment?
It really depends on how building is ventilated. Many modern office buildings are actually quite good at filtering out PMs in general. Some aren't. PMs are something that we think should be continuously monitored, simply because the outside environment can change so rapidly, we're about to see. In fact, the building's ability to respond, the quality of its filtration, is something that should be under continuous study.
And do you recommend monitoring, suppose you're monitoring indoor particulates, would you monitor outdoor as well to see the difference, or does that matter?
It does matter. It matters very much for gases because you want attribution. You want to know where this is coming from, and is it coming from outside or inside the building. Most buildings aren't generating particulates except in manufacturing, but you still need a comparison. You want to say what is the difference between inside and outside, and again, that you may say, well, we can only expect certain performance out of this HVAC system. If the outside air is extremely polluted, there may be a limit to what we can do. We might stop drawing air into a building, for example, at the most polluted times of day. We'd say the building should hold its breath, perhaps in the morning rush hour, and at that point you can start monitoring internal CO2 until the point where the CO2 level is sufficiently high that you go, no, we have to start drawing air in again.
And if we could switch focus to the sensors themselves, and I know you've taken a lot of time and been quite intentional about the design of the sensors. Can you talk a little bit about the specification and how you've approached it?
We began by designing equipment for environmental scientists, for academics, for United Nations Environment Programme, and everybody had a long and different list of what they wanted to sense and in what sort of harsh environment they wanted to work. So we had to create very modular systems, both in terms of the electronics and in terms of the data systems and the open source software that we deliver. We have equipment that we use for internal air quality, but we want to create an optimized offering for this. So we're still watching how the IAQ standards, like the Well Institute standards and others, are developing. And we're talking to customers and potential customers, architects and so on. This little thing here was a challenge because it's about 30 centimeters long. The Well building standard says devices have to be at head height, which is sensible because it's kind of where your mouth and your nose are. And so that created a challenge. What could you stick on a wall? We talked to people about communications and found that actually 4G was probably the right thing to use even in internal settings. So we try out ideas on people, and we're still talking to people. We're going on developing the electronics and the computation that goes on inside these devices that's standard for us now across rugged outdoor devices, handheld devices, and now internal devices. And we're kind of going on talking before we commit to some internal designs.
I know you've approached at least the sampling. You use parts per billion, but a lot of people talk about parts per million. Like, can you talk about the differences between the two?
All of the kind of gas sensors came from a safety environment where you're measuring in parts per million. And for environmental health, environmental science, you're talking about parts per billion. So you're moving from, say, a car sat-nav that can measure to plus or minus 10 meters to something that can measure down to a centimeter. There are a few gases like CO2 where concentrations are sufficiently high that parts per million still works. But looking at things like nitrogen dioxide and nitric oxide and ozone, having an accuracy to plus or minus a small number of parts per billion is significant. And for PMs, having plus or minus a handful of micrograms per cubic meter is really significant. We can do that now. It's kind of getting a price that people want if they're populating a large office building with sensors. But there, some of the skills that people are developing is, answering the question, how many sensor systems, how many sensor devices does an office building need, and what sort of reconnaissance could you do in terms of trial deployments of devices to find that out.
A question that we had from the audience was around ad hoc monitoring versus permanent placement. What is your view regarding moving sensors around an indoor environment?
You will find some buildings which are in a sufficiently clean environment that you can temporarily install some sensors and find that consistently low readings, and then maybe step back and say we only need perhaps one or two sensors, perhaps a sensor in the reception area or in a lobby area of a building. And then others that are in a sufficiently polluted environment, you really ought to be monitoring all the time that there are people in the building. And, there is a very, very strong correlation between toxicity of the environment and the cost per square meter of office space. Some of the, most expensive business properties in the world are in the most polluted places in the world.
I think we've touched on the World Building Standard. For those of you that haven't read the certification guidelines, I think it is the benchmark for healthy buildings. Now, we've already talked about CO2, particulates and so forth that have been covered in the standard, but can you talk a little bit more about carbon monoxide, NO, ozone? Like how do these affect people?
Carbon monoxide, it kind of kills you. Carbon monoxide was typically, not generated inside a building. It's generated by the traffic outside. Comparing it with nitrogen dioxide, the more efficient a combustion engine is, the hotter the detonation of the fuel and the more NO2 is created. The best new jet engines have a combustion temperature that's about half that of the surface of the sun. And to put that inside a metal box that's flying around is an amazing achievement. But air chemistry goes a bit strange at that point, and a lot of NO2 gets created. We've been continuously monitoring for about 18 months now at both Heathrow and Gatwick, and correlating gas concentrations and particulates with aircraft movements. It's been quite fun. NO2 and ozone are both toxic to people in the sort of concentrations you normally get. They don't kill you outright, but they will compromise your immune system ultimately. As I say, we think it's crucial to understanding air quality in the context of COVID. How clean is the air? Is enough fresh air coming into this human-occupied space to reduce potential COVID density?
And CO2 just makes you lethargic, completely unproductive. I think people kind of miss the factor of productivity is really, really hard to measure, but with high CO2 levels, it's brain fog kicks in, sleepiness kicks in. It's a horrible thing to be exposed to and try to be clear thinking and clearly focused. So there is also that aspect of it. We talk a lot about accuracy. I've personally seen consumer grade air quality sensors, people putting, 5 of them next to each other side by side in the same room and them spitting out different numbers, which might as well be random number generators, to be honest with you. What has been your approach to testing and really ensuring that the data accuracy is correct?
We started with the principle that since we knew these sensors, particulate counters, for example, do perform well in the lab, there wasn't any point in doing lab work. We needed to create devices that you could deploy in real-world environments and keep them running, usually co-located with reference equipment in different environments, and see how they behave. So the answer how you do quality assurance, the first thing you do is you make robust devices that really work in the field and let you collect a lot of data. And we started doing that with the UN in Nairobi, in Addis Ababa, and in Dakar, and in Costa Rica as well. Those, particularly something like Addis Ababa, it has sharp changes in temperature and humidity throughout the day, every day. So that taught us a lot about how do you make devices work in harsh environments. And it raised big questions about what the influences of the environment were on sensors. And these charts are for particulate, for PM2.5. The same similar phenomena happen with gas sensors. And the intriguing thing that made us carry on the work was that if you put two of these sensors in the same place, you always get the same answer. Sometimes it's the same wrong answer, but there's utter consistency in what they do. And so South Coast Science partnered with Ricardo Energy and Environment, who run the government AURN reference sites, and we chose 3 of them and co-located some of our equipment. And over, as I say, now 18 months, we collected a lot of data. We had theories of what the correction should be, but that those models were quite complex. And in the end, I gave up and started a machine learning approach. And it seems to have worked extremely well. So on the left here, you have the spread of results from the sensor itself, the raw data output from the sensor. And you can see there's a sort of V-shape. So there are at least 2 different phenomena which are causing errors. And with 6 months of collocation data from 3 different sites, machine learning model we trained to correct, and the graph on the right is the corrected data. So the tie-up between the reference on the x-axis and the corrected data on the y-axis is really very encouraging, and we're in the process of submitting devices for MCERTS testing at National Physical Laboratory. And for particulates, that's going to be the benchmark. For gases, there isn't an MCERTS certification program yet. But in general, I'm very keen to have continuous public access that compares reference equipment with third-party low-cost sensor suppliers like South Coast Science and anybody who wants to join us. I've been pushing for the UK Knowledge Transfer Network to fund this. I would love to see it happen because, there has and still is a lot of snake oil out there of people offering low-cost devices that have a whole range of correlation with reality. And it's very difficult for people who want to obtain equipment to know whether what they're getting is any good.
And then I guess the next step, you've possibly instrumented your building, you need to understand the data. And I believe this was the graph that you were talking about when you were talking about the kind of looking at information in terms of exposure during the day rather than taking snapshots.
Sure. This is from the 21st of September, so a couple of days ago. This is 24 hours starting 8 or 9 a.m. on the left for 24 hours in central Birmingham, close to a large construction site. Orange is PM10, green is PM2.5. And there's a tiny bit of blue at the front, which is PM1. So clearly you have a building site which is operating from about 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. or something. But even within that daytime period, there's huge variation in the particulate density. And it would be interesting to measure that in the context of IAQ, and ultimately to have a HVAC system, for example, which can respond in real time to this sort of information. And it also helps you answer the question, so should you, if you're interested in internal air quality, be measuring outdoor air quality? And we say yes, and this is an illustration of why you might want to measure urban air quality, both, for example, at street level at the front door of the building, so that the occupants understand the difference between their exposure on the street and their exposure inside, and also at the air intake or air intakes of the HVAC system. So there are times when you really shouldn't be drawing air in at all, even if it's filtered. So yeah, the top of this graph is 1,000 micrograms. Looking at the well standard talks about 50 micrograms per cubic meter. The top of the y-axis here is 1,000. And this is not a particularly unusual state of affairs in a city centre.
And then depending on the performance of the filtration system, that is getting pumped into the internal environment. I guess from the OpenSensors side, a lot of the data that we look at is, pretty much all the data we look at is internal data. And what we also see is this variation depending on occupant density as well as other factors. So the way we look at it is through, like Bruno mentioned before, throughout the working day, as well as a 24-hour period. But what is the most important is the exposure of people. So kind of between 8 or 7 a.m. to 6 or 7 in the evenings. And the other way that we like to look at the data is also through, on a spatial level, is looking at the hotspots of where spikes are, because that's when you start tackling problems from a zone perspective. I mean, I think there's quite a number of takeaways that are going to be had, but I would like to stress this link between this importance between ventilation and occupancy, and both are things that need to be managed very, very closely. As people do their return to office planning, what they're focusing on is phasing of occupancy, which is correct. You have to kind of start small and gradually phase more and more people back, and depending on what is happening with the local situation in regards to COVID, but really keeping an eye on the environmental, especially CO2, especially particulates and so forth, is quite critical. And I think that side is left quite a bit. When we talk about occupancy, we're lumping quite a lot into that category. And that really means, how many people are in the building, but also the floor plate, the area, meeting rooms and so forth. And we've broken down types of occupancy sensors and how these are measured in other videos, and if Tumai, if you can drop that into the chat and also share that around, so just so that you can have a wider view of what occupancy means. There's quite a lot of detail under the occupancy umbrella, but we don't have enough time to flesh all things out, so we're trying to give you as much information as possible. But most people are starting with around 30% occupancy levels, looking at the kind of environmental levels that Bruno mentioned, and then gradually increasing the points of the occupancy levels. And then just to summarize, I understand we've thrown a lot of information at you, but the critical factors are temperature, relative humidity, CO2, particulate 2.5 especially, and then the ventilation and occupancy. So really kind of keep an eye on these. Please do get in touch as you're going through your planning process. We're here to help. Bruno's contact details are here, and you can always find us at hello@opensensors.com, and then for South Coast Sciences, contact@southcoastscience.com. We'll be sharing this information around. If anything is not clear, in the meantime, please reach out. I really appreciate your time, Bruno. Is there anything else that
Thank you.
you want people to have a takeaway before they end the session?
Let's work together on what we should measure, how, with what sort of equipment, with what sort of data delivery. This is a good moment to start building these components. The components are being developed in the way that makes sense for the largest number of users. So it's a conversation that's live now.
I agree with that. The good thing is a lot of the groundwork had been laid thanks to the Well Building Standard. I guess the well-being agenda has gone up much more, and now it's not really about well-being now, it's about safety. And so we can take a lot of this information and research that's been done already, combine it with new research around COVID, and this is not new, it's just a newer context. So that's one thing that I would like people to take away with it. All right, thank you everyone. Have a good rest of your day.